I am an undergraduate student attending the University of Southern Mississippi. Currently, I am enrolled in the Fall 2017 Research Seminar class. Upon my enrollment in USM, I enrolled in the United States Army. My time in the military has inspired me to write this paper and ask the question, should women be allowed in combat? Throughout this semester, I have researched the impacts of women in the military. In January of 2016, the Pentagon announced that it would open all jobs in the military to women, to include combat. Since that time, a large amount of data has been collected on the impact this has had on the military. Throughout this research, I have focused on two major themes. One, addressing the objections to women in the military and in combat. And secondly, the harmful impacts gender exclusion has to women, men, and the military. Before going further, it is important to note the classification of being in combat is not exclusive to combat roles, meaning to be in combat, soldiers must be personally present and actively engaging or being engaged by the enemy. In the military, there are three job types: combat, combat support, and combat service support. Combat, meaning infantry, field artillery, armor, etc. Combat support, meaning military police, engineer, aviation, etc. And combat service support, being transportation, ordnance, chaplain, etc. There are four common objections that people have to women being in the military and being in combat. 1, biological differences. 2, lowering standards. 3, team cohesion. And 4, protection of women. First, we're going to discuss the biological differences. It is a fairly well-known fact that women and men are biologically different. Well, this leads people to conclude that because women do not have the same physical advantages as men, they do not belong in combat roles. It is important to understand that combat has changed since medieval times. No one is running around on a horse in a suit of armor carrying a sword. Instead, war is now fought with guns, bombs, and intelligence. Secondly, lowering standards. Since the inclusion of women in combat roles, physical standards have not lowered. Instead, they have become more clearly defined. For example, the OPAT, the Occupational Physical Assessment Test. The OPAT is designed to evaluate a soldier's potential physical ability. Based on performance, the recruit is then placed in one of 4 categories: black, gray, gold, and white. Black allowing access to all 3 job categories. Gray allowing access to combat support and combat service support. Gold allowing access to only combat service support, and white designating the individual as unqualified for service. Similarly, the physical standards to get in and graduate from specialty schools like Ranger School, Airborne, and Air Assault have remained the same among all age groups and between genders. Third, team cohesion. Over the course of history, the composition of the military has changed quite a bit. For example, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. As to be expected, with any integration, there is always a rough transitional period. Group psychologists have labeled the cause of this tokenism. What is often seen is that the longer the integration lasts, the more accepting the two groups become of one another. Research has shown that after these transitional periods, the military is even more effective than before. This is because these different groups now have commonly shared experiences. And finally, the protection of women. This argument starts the transition from objections to the harm gender exclusion has on women, men, and the military. It is outdated to think women need to be protected by men. This argument also contains a logical fallacy by misrepresenting the nature of war. In the military, you are trained to a soldier first, because all jobs in the military have the potential to see a combat at some point. The second part of this argument is the belief that gender exclusion will protect women from sexual assault. This mindset is problematic for many reasons. It fosters an environment of complacency, believing that this will result in stopping sexual assault. In fact, further integration of women only increases positive impacts of the elimination of sexual assault. Continuing on to the direct harms of gender exclusion. The largest harm that gender exclusion has for women are economic. The military offers incentive pay for being in combat zones, being in combat, and holding combat jobs. With women excluded from the opportunity of this pay, it creates an involuntary wage gap. It also harms women promotion opportunities in the military. Non-commissioned officers are promoted on a point system. Some of these points categories include specialty schools that are combative in nature, as well as experienced in hazardous duty. This continues to widen the previously discussed wage gap. On a personal note, I am an ROTC here at USM. I am evaluated based upon a Order of Merit list, or OML. One of the subcategories of my OML includes these specialty schools that are combative in nature, example, airborne, air assault, etc. Because many cadets want active duty, it is extremely competitive. The difference between getting active duty and National Guard is often decided by just a few points. The issue is compounded when women transfer to the civilian world. One of the largest benefits of the military are transferable job skills. If women were limited to job fields where there is no possibility for combat, they would be limited to jobs when transferred to the civilian world would be very low paying. For example, being a secretary, being a cook, a typist, etc. It also keeps women from receiving highly sought after leadership skills. Moving on, harms to men. When women are excluded from combat jobs, men are disproportionately affected because more of them will be forced into combat roles, putting them in more dangerous situations. This issue is compounded when drafts are implemented to compensate for the number of slots they need to be filled. Unwillingly, men are selected. It should go without mentioning that these slots could be filled by willing women. So there are men who are forced to join the military when they do not want to. The government is pardoning criminals in return for service, and men forced into combat jobs that have no interest in doing so. And finally, harms to the military. This puts the government in a morally compromised situation because they are cut off from half of the potential pool of recruits, requiring them to put people that they swore to protect in harm's way. It also harms the probability of mission success, because it is limiting soldiers from the amount and type of training they can receive, simultaneously cutting the military off from the unique benefits of having women in combat. During the invasion of the Middle East, male soldiers were not allowed to engage with women in any way, cutting off access to a large portion of resources. As a result, the military created female engagement teams, also known as FET. These teams were able to interact with women as well as search female suspects. Attaching these engagement teams to combat units allowed these units to gain more information, better security, and build relationships with locals. In conclusion, my research has identified and addressed multiple concerns associated with gender inclusion. This research has determined that these objectives have no legitimate foundation. Furthermore, my research has identified and addressed harms of gender exclusions not only to women themselves, but to men and the military. It is apparent to me that gender inclusion can only yield significant positive impact. Thank you for your time. I hope that you found this research topic interesting and educational. This is Cadet Person signing off. Southern Miss to the top, and Eagle Strike.